Heaven is sad. Reality is no obstacle. Thinking leads nowhere. Hope is a mistake. I've recently fallen into a major reading slump and found that the best way to emerge from it was to return to the one writer who feels most like home to me, who, although he doesn't write in German, speaks the mother tongue of my heart, if you will. The apocalypse as the natural state of the universe, sentences that go on for over 400 pages. I'm of course talking about the hopeful darkness and hopeless light of László Krasznahorkai. As his friend Max Sebald said about him, the universality of his vision rivals that of Gogol's Dead Souls and far surpasses all the lesser concerns of contemporary writing. Now, what I want to do in this video is not give you a review of his books or a beginner's guide to long sentences or whatever, but I will try to explain my reading of him, what it implies, and why it can be such a powerful experience. And as you will see, this might be a very self-contradictory endeavor, since explaining and formulating through words what is implied and hinted at is just what his writing opposes in a way, but more on that later. I'll start with a longer exploration of the motifs in Krasznahorkai's debut novel Satantango, and then move forward from there, looking at new perspectives and slight shifts in focus as the oeuvre moves along. If you haven't read the books mentioned here, don't worry, I won't give away the whole plot and possible twists. If anything, I'd be happy to motivate you to pick them up to experience them yourself. Maybe you remember what Deleuze and Guattari started their book on Kafka with, a quote, "How can we enter into Kafka's work? This work is a rhizome, a burrow. We will enter then by any point whatsoever. None matters more than another, and no entrance is more privileged even if it seems an impasse, a tight passage, a siphon. We will be trying only to discover what other points or entrance connects to, what crossroads and galleries one passes through to link two points, what the map of the rhizome is and how the map is modified if one enters by another point." Unquote. Austrian Nobel Prize winner Peter Handke once wrote, "Die Form ist das Gesetz, the form is the law." And of course Krasznahorkai's prose deals with what cannot be talked about in a different manner than it does. So a video review is bound to fail, but maybe you can view it as the personal rambling of a fan that may or may not make you pick up some of his books or share how you read him. And what's more is that moving forward, we'll see, and this is a claim I feel comfortable making, that every book kind of implicitly comments somewhat on itself, somewhat on the others, on the whole, so they teach you how to read them, which is a fascinating experience. Krasznahorkai's debut novel Satantango is probably his most famous one, and it was actually the book that made me want to share my readings with more people since I was part of 2 reading groups of it simultaneously, and my thoughts on it didn't seem to stop coming and growing, it just has so much to offer. The novel takes a look at a small Hungarian village where various characters spend their more or less miserable lives, hoping for something better, and it's structured in 12 so-called dances, 1 to 6 in part 1, and then 6 to 1 in part 2 again. Begins with a mercilessly long reign starting, maybe even an infinite one as the German translation calls it. From the opening page on, you aren't sure whether the various signs and symbols are reason enough for the inhabitants to be hopeful. The bells waking up the character Futaki might as well be apocalyptic, and where Mrs. Schmidt awakes from a nightmare, you don't know whether the reality is any better because everything seems to be in a state of bleak abeyance. And this eternity, or being stuck without an end in sight, is underlined by a harrowing vision Futaki has, quote, "He gazed sadly at the threatening sky, at the burned-out remnants of a locust-plagued summer, and suddenly saw on the twig of an acacia, as in a vision, the progress of spring, summer, fall, and winter. As if the whole of time were a frivolous interlude on the much greater spaces of eternity, a brilliant conjuring trick to produce something apparently orderly out of chaos, to establish a vantage point from which chance might begin to look like necessity, and he saw himself nailed to the cross of his own cradle and coffin, painfully trying to tear his body away, only eventually to deliver himself, utterly naked, without identifying mark, stripped down to essentials, into the care of the people whose duty it was to wash the corpses, people obeying an order snapped out in the dry air against a background loud with tortures, flares of skin, where he was obliged to regard the human condition without trace of pity, without a single possibility of any way back to life. So, while the situation is bad, it can always get worse, with even death not being a permanent end but a mere warning. When Futaki senses that something will happen today, we already suspect it won't be for the better, and what happens is that the messianic figure Eremias, at least messianic in their eyes, returns with his helper to change things for the better, or that's what he promises. I don't want to talk about the plot too much though, nor at how the different chapters aren't linear and vary in tone. That's all for you to discover, but rather take a look at the book's background colors and central images. Several, if not all locations are figuratively and literally rotting. The daylight is dimmed as if it were dusk, but they sit and wait for the even darker, the true night. And whenever we come across artificial light, it's almost blinding. A recurring motif is that of facades. The doctor doesn't cure anymore, the lovers don't love, the girl doesn't really play, and maybe the gods and prophets don't save us. Jeremias, the savior, finds the right words for the general situation when he describes how they are eternally exposed in between two times, neither of which is theirs. One thing you will notice very soon when reading is the relationship of the inside and the outside as a very prominent image, and there's no clear border between separating the two. We have a scenery that is covered in mud, alcohol, urine and sweat, and the rain leaks into the homes and even the bodies, as the character notes, much like the false information and lies do as well. And even the pairs of alternatives in the village, or dualities if you will, appear to be washed into each other too, as if by rain. Dusk or night, war or wasteland, sleep and have a nightmare or live the nightmare, it doesn't seem to make a huge difference. The town is out of reach and the light can never quite shine through. Because the rift between the people who are supposed to care for each other is too deep. Quote, all these thousands of echoing rhythms, this confusing clatter of night noises, all parts of an apparently common stream, that is the attempt to forget this pair. Though behind things, other things appear as if by mischief, and once beyond the power of the eye, they no longer hang together. So with the door left open as if forever, with a lock that will never open, there's a chasm, a crevice. So here we have the next important image of connection and disconnection, of being tied together while ultimately remaining isolated, which is most prominent in the image of the countless spiders who are waiting, plotting and spinning the webs. And this is a crucial point because while these images are obviously centered in the text and in its plot, both motifs try to go beyond the page and reach at the reader. So this border of the book's inside and outside too is kind of erased when the reader becomes entangled in the webs and the confusions and suspicions of the characters become your own. You might compare this shared feeling of the reader almost being another character in the text to the paranoia of something like Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49. And in fact, it's no surprise that the epigraph to Seiobo there below reads, either it's night or we don't need light, Thelonious Monk, Thomas Pynchon. The reader gets invited to interpret the signs, read the symbols, connect the lines of the spider's web, thus getting entangled in the narrator's bigger web. The content mirrors the form, mirrors writing, mirrors life. There is, for example, a part of the novel where the doctor reads a book about Hungarian geology. It very much reads like a comment on Satantango itself and the questions I had as a reader. Quote, nevertheless, as he read, the history of the earth, that had seemed so solid, so fixed under and around him, came alive. Though the unknown author's awkward, unpolished style, the book being written now in the present and now in the past tense, confused him. So he couldn't be sure whether he was reading a work of prophecy regarding the Earth's condition after the demise of humanity or a proper work of geological history based on the planet on which he actually lived. One other example of the text's outside is you're constantly asking yourself who it is that is narrating, while you stumble across syntactical oddities and almost personal remarks too. There's a hasty passage comparable to the Thunderwords in Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce that describes the conditions of life for the people in a nutshell. I quote, it was dawn and getting lighter, or evening and growing darker, and she didn't want it all ever to come to an end. She just had no idea what was happening. Nothing changed outside. It was neither morning nor evening. It just carried on, dawn or twilight, whichever. This reads like the essence of the condition of the book's characters, but its form and the question of the narrator touches on what Krasznahorkai later said in an interview. I quote, the novel form itself is anthropocentric. It starts with the problem of the narrator, and that will remain forever. Which brings us to another important point. I mentioned the spiders and their webs, and in fact animals do play a role that is not to be ignored if you want to understand the hierarchy in the universe or lack thereof. In Satantango, humans have the characteristics of animals, not only in appearance but also behavior, and there are countless instances where someone is compared to or insulted as an animal. So the hierarchy of human above animal, above things, maybe God above them all, is in shambles and intertwined. The characters have to act to set up an artificial order. It only makes sense then that not only humans but animals and things are communicating with each other too. Quote, the objects around him that had so far been merely listening started up a nervous conversation. As with the humans, there is no clear hierarchy since everyone defeats each other. This is tied with another major motive of Krasznahorkai, namely the angelic, the possibility of something or someone pure in a corrupted world, the impossibility of innocence. If you've read Satantango, you know I'm talking about the little girl Esti, who is the center of one of the most beautifully touching passages in all of Krasznahorkai's oeuvre. A quote from an interview, in every novel I've written, there is a defenseless, angel-like character. like Esti in Satantango or Valushka in The Melancholy of Resistance, who are wounded by the world. They don't deserve these wounds, and I love them because they believe in a universe where everything, including human existence, is wonderful, and I respect them for that belief. But their view of the universe, of the world, this belief in innocence, is impossible for me. For me, we belong more to the animal world. We are animals, only the victorious ones. Nevertheless, we live in a highly anthropomorphic world. We think we inhabit a human world in which there is a realm for animals, for plants, for stones. This is not the truth. Satantango and, as we will see, all of Krasznahorkai's books really, are partly about witnessing glimpses of something we cannot understand, perceiving hints at a higher order we have no way of accessing, or maybe lower order, or just a different one. But kind of like the whole book is fighting against being read conventionally by dragging the reader down and keeping us on ground level, confusing with shifts in syntax and tense, Jeremias seems to anticipate that in this key passage. God is not made manifest in language, you dope. He's not manifest in anything, he doesn't exist. God was a mistake. I've long understood there's zero difference between me and a bug, or a bug and a river and a voice shouting above it. There's no sense or meaning in anything. It's nothing but a network of dependency under enormous fluctuating pressure. It's only our imaginations, not our senses, that continually confront us with failure and the false belief that we can raise ourselves by our own bootstraps from the miserable pulp of decay. There's no escaping that, stupid. This is of course quite akin to Nietzsche's madman proclaiming that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, but what is more important to me is how this relates to language, as another character proclaims, only that which has been conceptualized can happen. We will see in the other books that logic, words, conceptualization is probably the major struggle that opposes the access to another kind of order, maybe the one hinted at by the angelic characters, but more on that later. A last word on the book. Despite the heavy content, the way the characters act can be very comical, at times even clownish. Good things happening to the characters are usually mere indicators for worse to come, and so are the humorous parts, but Krasznahorkai himself said in an interview, "I dream of light, but I live in the shadow. I cannot escape, that's why I'm so funny." And in another one, "If I had to choose between a universe without a framework and humanity as a framework, I would choose humanity." Now that I've gone through some of the most important images and motifs for Krasznahorkai, we can take a look at how they play out and develop in his later works. I should mention though that it's ironic to talk about the whole of Krasznahorkai's work and doing so by talking about its parts, since he in fact wanted to write one book and one book only. In an interview with Michael Silverblatt for Bookworm, he said regarding the publication of Baron Wenkheim's Homecoming, "I can now conclude the story with this novel. I can prove that I've really only written one book in my life. The book is called Satantango, The Melancholy of Resistance, War and Baron Wenkheim's Homecoming. This is my one book." The reason he didn't stop after finishing Satantango and had it grow into this sort of tetralogy together with the three others was, as he says, whenever he was forced to go back and reread them, he found flaws in the rhythm. And in the instance of Satantango, it was the director Belatar who asked him if he could film it, which made him reread it and help with the movie adaptation as a writer. There's the quote, "I consider my books failures." And in another instance, he replies, "An error in a sentence kills me. That's why I can't stand reading my books. Because it's practically impossible to write a 300-page book without a single mistake." And that's why, with his typical humor, he finds himself in the situation to, quote, "appear in front of an audience to tell them why they shouldn't read my texts." There is, from what I can tell, one exception to that rule, the book I'll talk about at the very end. It does make sense. You do get the feeling that Krasznahorkai wanted to write only one book if you read more by him, since the various images and topics he wrestles with, in both content and form, are very much overtly present in Satantango, all laid out. While later on he'd not tone it down, but find a way to tackle them from various standpoints, slightly shifting the focus between them. So if you haven't read any of his books yet and wonder where to start, Satantango is a good place. Though I'll decidedly say that you don't have to, and Krasznahorkai would agree by saying that each of the 4 books mentioned are each present in one another. But don't worry, I won't go into the same level of detail with the 3 other as with Satantango. Like Deleuze and Guattari said about Kafka, I'm always trying to find a way out. And like Krasznahorkai said, we always have to start from scratch and start differently. Right off the bat, before I even talk about the book, since I just mentioned Belatar, reading The Melancholy of Resistance and watching Belatar's adaptation, The Werkmeister Harmonies, afterwards is one of the best or most profound artistic experiences you can have. Just a side note here. What Melancholy masters is a certain kind of switch in an outlook on the world. You can really pinpoint the moment, or more broadly speaking, the development of how the angelic is once again corrupted in the character of Valushka. A major difference to Satantango is that Krasznahorkai seems to take it further here in a few regards. It tones down in some of the meta-narrative aspects, but is more radical in others. At its beginning though, it too starts with various ominous signs like the town's water tower swaying dangerously, the clock of the church which has been immobile for decades suddenly striking, and of course a circus with the world's biggest whale as the main attraction, which summons a mass of immovable and silent strangers onto the market square until hell may or may not break loose. In Melancholy we hear for the first time explicitly what would become one of Krasznahorkai's main motives, namely the relationship of the whole and its parts, or the absence and impossibility of a whole as such. Some quotes: "The significance is in the elements, not in the whole. Only he can see the whole," he says, "because he can see there is no whole. The whole does not exist. The unyielding, indifferent, universal incomprehensibility of things, intolerable to the inexplicable ground rules of human conduct. Making is half, ruin is everything." And we find this notion sort of having a direct confrontation in the form of our protagonist Valushka, who says and thinks things like, quote, "Though the cosmos was vast and the earth merely a tiny speck within it, the force that drove that cosmos was ultimately joy. All this was good, and furthermore, it had some secret core, a central point, not precisely a meaning but some kind of substance or mass, lighter, more delicate than a single breath, whose unforgettable radiance could not reasonably be denied and could be ignored only by those who failed to look." Valushka, angelic in nature as Esti has been in Satantango, has more room in the book than she did, so we get to see what is called the redundancy of the angelic and the, quote, "intangible embodiment of the airy angelic realm at the point where it overflows into the mundane," unquote, in a wider perspective. The confrontation is incredibly well executed, as for example in this quote: "Only the corner of a room could look so empty and smell so sour, and yet, to Valushka's eyes, it was stuffed full of horrors, as if whatever happened or might have happened had soaked into it. It was like staring into the eyes of a leering monster he didn't until then realize existed at all." Something I want to mention about these four novels is one, is that in each case the pace is chopped up by shifts in perspective, tone and time, so they don't accelerate and end in apocalypse, but the going back to the mundane shows clearer the, quote, "necessity of all such things, insofar as all such things existed in their own natural state of chaos." The aspect of humans not being above objects is still explicitly present, like in these quotes. "She herself was nothing more but an object among objects, one of millions of defenseless sleepers, a body like others, returning each night to those melancholy gates of being which may be entered but once and then with no prospect of return," unquote. And "in the thick darkness of a room it seemed nothing stirred. The dirty water in the enema basin was preternaturally still. On the three hooks of the clothes rack, like great sides of beef above a butcher's counter, hung her sweater. Her raincoat and a substantial quilted jacket, the bunch of keys hanging from the lock had stopped swinging, having finally absorbed her earlier momentum." I mentioned earlier that some of the meta-narrative aspects of Satantango have been toned down, but in fact Krasznahorkai shows his humor by seemingly writing about the book itself once again through his character's narrator. Quote, "He should remain undisturbed, and live only for that which he now considered to have been his mission in the first place, that is to recline on his bed and banish boredom by composing, day and night, sentences like variations on the same bitter theme." Or, "It was one long unbroken story related in the stuttering and excitable prose his visitor had regaled him with each noon and every late afternoon for the last 8 years. Or, "He kept turning the spiral-bound squared pages of the notebook as he devoured their content. And so, having reached the end of the accounts, he turned over again and found himself back at the beginning, where, recalling his disturbingly guilty self of the day before, and recognizing today's much more frightening figure in that fragment of corrective text which seemed to lead back to its beginning, he too started again in the belief that what didn't go down properly the first time might be fully absorbed the second time around." Or maybe you see yourself in this one. Everyone was in the same condition. Not so much convinced as flattened by the sheer weight of the director's rolling, irresistible cadences, by the combined force of something that comprised statements, arguments, pleas and revelations, in fact so utterly buried were they under it, they needed someone to come along and dig them out. And it was not surprising that it took them some time before they recovered all their faculties and the numbness slowly drained from them. And when a character gives a little speech, he mocks the phrases the narrator uses, the ones we actually read in the book, quote, "Because you don't talk, you whisper or expostulate. You don't walk down the street but proceed feverishly. You don't enter a place but cross its threshold. You don't feel cold or hot, but find yourself shivering or feeling the sweat pour down on you." Now, while Melancholy has one of the great endings, War and War starts with this opening line that kind of encapsulates the intertwining poles, or what on the surface seems like opposite sides of Krasznahorkai. Quote, "I no longer care if I die," said Corinne. Then, after a long silence, pointed to the nearby flooded quarry. "Are those swans?" It's a book I really anticipated reading. One sentence on what it deals with. György Corinne discovers a mysterious manuscript in the Hungarian archive he works at and travels to New York, where he plans to preserve it for eternity before committing suicide. An important quote from it that, as usual, not only highlights one singular character's state of mind, but is a broader comment on the whole body of work. He suddenly felt, and felt most intensely, that he should be seeing something that he wasn't seeing, that he should be comprehending something he was not comprehending, that there was, from time to time, right in front of his eyes, something he should be seeing, something blindly obvious, but that he did not know what it was, knowing only that, without seeing it, he had no hope of understanding the place he had arrived at. Personally, this reminds me of 1 Corinthians 13:12, which could be the epigraph of most of Krasznahorkai's books with one limitation. Quote, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known." Krasznahorkai or his characters would probably argue that there is now then, whereas the uncorrupted angelic do know, just not through language and logic. This will be tremendously important when we'll take a look at Seiobo there below, but I get ahead of myself. These descriptions of War and War sound, of course, excitingly gritty and fast-paced rhythm-wise. Quote, "In one way it really does work, but in another," said Corinne, his eyes beginning to burn, "it really doesn't. It really does not work at all." I did feel, though, that it was a bit all over the place, that it didn't really know what it wants to be. This does not mean, however, that it's not a good book. Just listen to this sentence, for example, that I don't even have to repeat the same line again, can be read as a meta-comment. "The enormous mass of dark sky above the smashed neon, the sky which might have glimpsed the reflection of its enormous dark mass, as it trembled with the stars and the vista of railway yards spreading below it. Had there been some relationship between the trembling stars and the twinkling dull red lights of semaphores sprinkled among the rails? But there wasn't. There was no common denominator, no interdependence between them, the only order and relationship existing within the discrete worlds of above and below, and indeed of anywhere, for the field of stars and the forest of signals stared as blankly at each other as does each and every form of being, blind in darkness and blind in radiance, as blind on earth as it is in heaven, if only so that long moribund symmetry among this vastness might appear in the lost glance of some higher being, the center of which, naturally, there would be a minuscule blind spot." I don't have the space here to discuss each of the novels with the depth they deserve, so I want to point out a step from Melancholy to War and War that is the explicit dealing with the topic of thinking and the possibility of acquiring knowledge through it, trying in vain to give his thoughts some shape. The mystery obscured by the unknowable and inexplicable was more important than anything else could possibly be. This uncertainty is the sole factor. And then we get the connection that I hinted at when mentioning Seiobo there below, quote, "The appropriateness of the one great universal process of thinking is not predicated on it being correct, for there was nothing to compare it with, nothing but its own beauty, and it was its beauty that gave us confidence in its truth." And a man who recognizes that what he is doing is as pointless as it is meaningless, and furthermore that precisely because it lacks point and meaning, it is accompanied by an entirely mysterious yet quite inimitable sweetness. But with the limitation, as if such peace and such sweetness really existed, as if it were possible. And if you ask yourself what exactly the title The Melancholy of Resistance refers to, there's a quote in War and War that goes, "The wholly pure love of which he spoke being resistance. The deepest and perhaps only noble form of revolt, because only love of this kind allowed a person to become perfectly, unconditionally, and in all respects free, and therefore, naturally, dangerous in the eye of this world, for this was the way things were." And now is a good time to mention that Krasznahorkai's books are not only connected through their shared motives, but also characters and places, which will be more obvious in Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming, where families and places from Satantango reappear, as well as books themselves. For example, in the story Universal Theseus from The World Goes On, a character gives a short speech about why the book Melancholy of Resistance got it all wrong. And other neat little instances are when, for example, Mihaly Vik, the musician who created the soundtrack for the Tar adaptations and who played Eremias in the Satantango movie, is mentioned in War and War, but more on that very important relationship between fiction and quote-unquote real life later. Another point of development is that the state of chaos and apocalypse is now more fundamentally embedded in everything, sort of metaphysically. We don't need to look at a whole group of people or a town and the consequences of catastrophe to understand its implications. Quote, all is of equal gravity, everything equally urgent and of the utmost importance. And everything would remain in this fatal state of balance between eternity and the march of time, that it was all going according to plan, ever growing on the one hand, ever diminishing on the other. Which doesn't mean, though, that an outright catastrophe cannot happen anymore, quite the contrary. And lastly, if you expected a quote on Krasznahorkai's style, once again you were right. In this instance, about his long-winded sentences, quote, trying to say everything at once in a single sentence, in one enormous last deep breath, that he knew all too well. But what the sixth chapter did was something altogether different, for here language simply rebels and refuses to serve, will not do what it was created to do. For once a sentence begins, it doesn't want to stop, not because, let's put it this way, because it is about to fall off the edge of the world, not, in other words, as a result of incompetence, but because it is driven by some crazy form of rigor, as if its antithesis, the short sentence, led straight to hell, as indeed it had tended to do with him, but not with the manuscript. For that was a matter of discipline, Corinne explained to the woman, meaning that this enormous sentence comes along and starts to ache itself, seeking over more precision, ever more sensitivity, and in so doing it sets out a complete catalogue of the capabilities of language, all that language can do and all it can't. And the words begin to fill the sentences, leaping over each other, piling up, but not as in some common road accident to be catapulted all over the place, but in a kind of jigsaw puzzle whose completion is of paramount importance, dense, concentrated, enclosed, suffocating, airless throng of pieces. That's how they are. I already talked about how the reader becomes part of the book's life by the interplay of its inside and outside, and there's a great quote by Krasznahorkai on War and War that goes, War and War is a novel that does not end on the last page, but it slides into reality, because what it discussed in the last pages of the novel, on the one hand, is also realized in reality, and on the other hand, it continues to write, but already in reality. That being said, it's finally time for an intermission on the elephant in the room before we take a look at Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming, the aforementioned length of Krasznahorkai's sentences, for which he's famous, or infamous I should say. In several interviews, Krasznahorkai talks about how the length of his sentences are not an artistic choice, but it's the only natural way for him to write, which has to do with how he perceives the world. Quote, the problem is that what I'm thinking about the universe should be expressed in words so quickly that there is no time for that. Which means that, since we speak in the same patterns we think in, this mode of expression is flawed from the beginning. And once we try to formulate our thoughts or experiences, they're gone. Sorry if this sounds like the introduction chapter from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I'll connect it back to literature in a second. Quote, we are part of such a big monumental whole that cannot be expressed in words or anything else, in which the only sincere and obligatory feeling for mere participation would be gratitude. And somewhere else he says, when it comes to the question of the universe, you always have several answers, precisely through language. For me, the power of words is the only way to get closer to this hidden reality. Every human being is both a real and a fictitious person. I belong to both the realms of fiction and reality. I exist in both worlds, you too. And everything that we perceive, even things that we don't, because as we know a part of reality is not perceivable with our five senses, I'm not saying it's esoteric. Reality is only so important to me that I do not want to overlook any possibility, unquote. So if you want to say something important and, as Krasznahorkai says, convince your interlocutor that this is a very important thing, you don't need full stops or commas, but, quote, pauses for breath and rhythm, tempo and melody. This is not a conscious decision. Rather, this kind of rhythm, melody and sentence structure arises from the desire to convince someone else, unquote. And that's why 1, he says my texts have plenty of time to breathe, and 2, I have no way of adequately judging the authentic meaning of his writings, since I can only read the German and English translations. So it's not just a stylistic choice, but a necessity dictated by the universal structure Krasznahorkai sees the world with. Quote, maybe the universe is only one huge, enormous sentence, and I try to find a small part when I can catch the sentence and follow it in the chaotic order of the universe. An interesting insight into what goes on in his head at all times is this quote, I work in my head and not at a desk. There are endless sentences running in my head, and at a point I feel that I can take one of them. And he explains, I write almost every minute, like a mill that never stops. I work non-stop because when one sentence starts, 100,000 more begin alongside it, like very fine spider webs. And one is somehow more important than all the others. I pull it out just enough so that I can work on it, correct it. When I work, the first thing I do is perfect the rhythmic elements of the movement. I work with a mechanism that is inherent to composing music as well as composing literature. Music, literature and the visual arts have a common root, rhythmic and tempo structures, and I work from this root. Music and novels are completely different in terms of content, but in their substance they are actually the same. We come around to one last important aspect of a style and knowing or not knowing about it when, again, we get to Seiobo there below. But first, the novel Krasznahorkai considered his biggest success up to that point. Quote, Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming is basically a summary of all my previous novels. I think it's my most successful novel, my funniest book. It's not full of apocalyptic messages, it's the apocalypse. It's already here. In an interview, Krasznahorkai answered the question whether he thinks he'll write another novel after Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming. A novel? No. When you read it, you'll understand why. Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming can only be the last one. This, of course, turned out not to be true, but it shows you its importance. So Baron Wenckheim is different novels inside one, and similar to Satantango, the chapters are structured by a dance card, and before you even come across the title page, there is a warning by the conductor of the book's orchestra. We see old Halix and Krana, who we know from the debut novel, or older family members by the same name, lay on the ground, quote, like an old, fatally exhausted, tottering tango dancer, lacking the energy for even one last breath. And in a not-to-Satantango, a church bell falls down through the roof, but nobody hears it. Quote, the bell was lying on the ground, turned upside down. What can that mean? Nothing, answered the person on the other side of the line, and he put the receiver down. And the festivity to welcome the Baron should even begin with the quote-unquote world-famous Satantango. Similar to Melancholy, there are several related or unrelated strange things happening. Quote, not only are they horrific, but they make no sense. And please permit me to explain this in a more adequate manner, as somehow the events serving as the basis of the reports, regardless of whether they are hearsay or actual events, lack any sort of coherence in and of themselves. And what is perhaps a bit less surprising is that there is no kind of intelligible connection whatsoever between them. Right in the previous novels we had instances of passages that seemed to implicitly comment on Krasznahorkai's writing style. Baron Wenckheim makes the problem of narration explicit, quote, to describe it like this is misleading, because then you'd think that somebody was saying this, that somebody was narrating, that somebody was putting into words. And there could be something to talk about, but there was no one left to say what happened. And that would only be the words following mechanically one after the other, as they lined up nicely in space in a single file. But there was no one anymore to say them, so let the words just line up one after the other. And lastly, these words, which can no longer be pronounced by anyone, don't even exist, because there isn't even time for them to appear. This problem is connected to this quote about articulating thoughts. You've come upon something and you don't have any words for it, and concepts aren't any use, but it's there. It's right there in your hands. You grasp at it compulsively, fearful it will slip away, and of course it does slip away once you open your palm. You try to track it down, but it's nowhere. It is said by my favorite character, the professor, who was once famous for his work on mosses, and here you see once again the variation of the core theme of finding meaning, quote, the mosses couldn't care less if I look at them or not, or what I know about them, or what I think about them. Mosses just are, and I too just am, and that's enough. This former professor does so-called mandatory thought immunization exercises, since he's an outspoken enemy of what he calls the trashy flea market of our ideas, and the virus of the quantitative approach, since for him, human existence is the same, with thought or without it. For him, the proper method of liquidating thought is, quote, the standing position. This is our basic stance in motionless observation. And what this entails are two things. First off, and this is once again a connection to the theme of our relationship to animals in the world, is acting by instincts, which the angelic characters seem to master. This will be really obvious and worked out most thoroughly in Herscht or 679, but it's also related to the embodied craft, which is key to Seiobo there below. A lovely quote here is, all such propositions are primitive. A child feels more than an adult knows, and a child knows more than it feels. Secondly, it is tied to the concept of nothingness in its various shades, be it destructive, enlightening, or humorous. In fact, the point could be made that nothingness is one of the center motives in Krasznahorkai's work. The professor, for example, says, the sentence "there is nothing" is in and of itself unintelligible, because only that which exists can be named. That which exists, however, is never extant, because nothing is extant, only that which takes place. And in this great flow there is nothing outside of itself, and this is the essential point, there is nothing within itself either. which he then connects to transcendence by saying, we should realize what an interesting mistake, what an inordinately interesting mistake it is to want clear-sightedness. And for us to think we can see clearly in any sort of matter, whichever it may be, whether in the matter of the infinite or of transcendence, because these are not mere topics, these are authentic unrealities. Krasznahorkai likes to take a look at this heavy topic with humor though, since what a lot of characters want is a very simple state of rest. A character in Satantango, for example, simply wants to put his feet into a tub of water at the end of the day, and in Baron Wenckheim we read, he really didn't need very much anyway. 1 can of beans with sausage and a little bit of wine every day, that was enough. One thing I haven't yet mentioned are the real or imagined supernatural events on the level of narration as well. It is one of many lines Krasznahorkai is blurring. In Satantango, for example, there's a whole chapter titled Heavenly Vision, Hallucination, in which said event happens to some characters on the plot level. But in Baron Wenckheim, this occurs one layer above, so to speak. It's as if we as the reader suddenly feel like something otherworldly enters the text, or otherbookly, or however you'd even call it, that catches us off guard, and the reason for that is its blunt force on the image level of evil omnipotence. And as I quoted Valushka's fear in Melancholy, listen to this passage where it once again appears as a universal element. The strength of this fear was unspeakably deep, primal, and overwhelming, and it didn't resemble any other earlier fear, not a single fear previously bearable or imaginable, because this wasn't even any kind of deathly horror with a nameable or unnameable cause. There was no cause, there wasn't even a word to name it, and it wasn't any mere evil projecting itself, but instead a kind of horror in which beings and objects under the effect of this horror were instead seized by wonder. This is both tied back to the aforementioned notion of nothingness, quote, in reality the fear that existence will cease, and that always in a given case it will cease, is the most elemental force that we know, which we will see in Herscht, as well as the joy previously seen in Valushka, quote, the fear that is within us and the joy of life that is within us, well, these two things are one and the same, two sides of one fact, because we are a web of events that seeks to sustain one thing and one thing only, namely continuity. And speaking of Valushka, if you ask yourself if this novel had an angelic character in it, listen to this sentence, which evokes the beginning of War and War. It's not that I don't understand why a person has to die, but rather I don't understand why a person has to live, Baron Bela Wenckheim pondered. And he is plagued by the question, if one good isn't enough for good to prevail, how is it possible that one evil is enough for evil to prevail? And the Baron is a nice contrast to the Professor, although contrast might not even be the right word since they are now opposites, but if you compare them to Buddhist disciples, one of them might be trying to get through to the nothing by trying not to try, while the other realizes the fruitful emptiness in an embodied, pre-logical way. I'll come back to this later though, but there is a quote regarding the Baron that hints at what I mean. What was he asking here when he himself already knew the answer? He had to come back down to earth with this question of his, and not pester the good Lord up there. Because this sudden whoosh from the deer, as they suddenly slipped across the tracks and were already swallowed up by the forest, was enough. As if they were trying to awaken him, or as if they wanted to rescue him from the weight of his own question. But it wasn't even that. What was he talking about? He shook his head. And he still didn't move from there. It wasn't the weight, because what kind of weight could a question like this have before the good Lord, who was so pestered by other questions, but that there wasn't even any question? Or that his question was completely meaningless, because his question, why did he have to live and so forth, simply wasn't a question, but was in itself the answer. This was the answer to his question, thought the Baron. His question was the answer. And indeed, one of the most important parts of the novel is when, as the title suggests, Baron Wenckheim returns home and takes a look at his old hometown, and it appears that instead of everything he once knew, there's something new that appears to be the same, but is entirely different. This world wasn't in its place. It looked like it was, but it wasn't. It only gave the appearance of being that way. Namely, he added and sensed ever more decisively that his thoughts were headed in the right direction. Nothing remained from the world that had been there. He could even have found it to be humorous if he had been capable of finding anything to be humorous. Where the train station used to be, there still stood a train station. Where the main street, named after his ancestors, used to be, there was still a main street, named after his ancestors. Where the hospital used to be, there was a hospital. Where the castle used to be, there was a castle. Where the chateau used to be, there was a chateau. And he could go on. It's just that these were not the same train stations, main roads, hospitals, castles, or chateaus. They just happened to stand in exactly the same spot where the old ones used to be. They weren't the old ones, they were new. They were different, they were strange, and they, now that the scales had fallen from his eyes, they left him completely cold. And this was completely to be expected, he determined, without any particular emotion, because what did he have in common with these train stations, these main roads, these hospitals, these castles and chateaux, if they weren't the same ones that had once stood in their place, so they were no concern of his any longer. In the documentary The Baron Returns from 2018 by Adam Breyer, Krasznahorkai is showing the director 2 maps of his and the Baron's hometown Gyula, one from the time of the Baron, one from the present, and says, "The 2, as you will see, are not identical, and they differ in a special way, and not because one of them is real and the other one is fictive, since that has nothing to do with each other. We both are staying in the present Hotel Komlo. The difference between the present Hotel Komlo and that of the Baron's Gyula lies in this. This one is Hotel Komlo, but this one, well, it's Hotel Komlo." At one point, they come across the place where Marika is living in the book and ask a local whether journalists had crowded there, telling her that the Baron is staying in Hotel Komlo. This is in reality in the documentary. And this brings up another important intermission on Krasznahorkai's relationship with his characters. One thing that always amazes me is the respect and even love with which Krasznahorkai talks about his characters. It makes sense that he once said, "There are no supporting characters in my books." But what's more important is that for him, they are not only all important, but also not just fictional. To quote him on the topic, "The characters do exist in an absolute sense, they live. They exist in a plane of the eternal. A few years after I wrote Satantango, I was sitting in a pub, and someone tapped me on the shoulder. It was Harlex from Satantango, seriously. That's why I've become more careful about what I write. The original version of War and War was originally about Corin's self-destruction in the first 100 pages, but I was afraid that I would meet him later in that state and not be able to help him." This is why he can say, "The people who find their way into my novels are not my creations," and that instead of being an author who creates from nothing, he's much rather what he calls a scripter. This relationship might need a bit of an illustration. His novel Herscht, 07769, is set in the fictional town of Kana, but when asked about the real town, 07768, Kala, Krasznahorkai explained that Kana and its fictional inhabitants are part of reality too, just of another one, another plane. One day Florian Herscht appeared behind his shoulder and told him that he wanted to be made real, to be written into existence. So Krasznahorkai did what was asked of him. And there even was a little incident after the reading where the quote-unquote real characters from the book came up to him, or what they thought would be the inspiration for the teacher and restaurant owner and so on, and said they didn't like that he exploited them, but for him it was clear that Kana is absolutely different from Kala, since it's real too. And regarding real people, he says that everyone is just acting out what is written, which is an interesting remark looking at his deal with the problem of narration and quotes like "only a god has the right to use the final period mark," which, adding to what I've said before, is another reason why Herscht, for example, is one single sentence over the course of over 400 pages. In the documentary The Baron Returns, he says, "I do not use reality, and reality is not used up, but rather, when I work, I start at the beginning and know no more than my characters." And moving on, "Literature is part of my private life. My private life only exists through words." And from another interview, "I do not sense the border between reality and fiction." And in a key scene in The Baron Returns, when he and the interviewer are walking through Gyula, he says, "Beware of the embers. You are not aware you are walking on ashes." I already touched on one aspect in passing when I said that War and War is set in different international locations, but primarily New York. Of course, what he is most famous for, and that's partly due to Béla Tarr's movie adaptations, is the cold, dark, windy and muddy desolation of Hungary. But a good amount of the stories take place in Asia. And the reason I specifically mention that is that the writing style is not as merciless, at least not on the surface, but rather tends to be almost meditative, while still remaining in touch with Krasznahorkai's core themes. While the long blocks of text oftentimes create speed in Satantango and Herscht, for example, they can slow everything down in the more meditative novels such as A Mountain to the North, A Lake to the South, Path to the West, A River to the East, and later Seiobo there below. A Mountain to the North, for example, is very much a story in the classical Japanese way of storytelling, and that it evokes a feeling that stays with you after reading. It's about the grandson of Prince Genji wandering through Kyoto looking for a secret temple garden. A slight unresolved sense of mystery, transience and beauty are much more important than plot and character development. This was my very first book by Krasznahorkai, and it immediately introduced me to the way some characters, such as the Professor and Baron Wenckheim that I mentioned before, deal with the impossibility of the infinite, in this case in a mathematical way. The quote-unquote highlights of the plot are seemingly unspectacular events, but the way the tension is able to build in this very toned-down environment of sentences is amazingly done. So much that I'd argue that A Mountain contains a couple of the strongest images in all of Krasznahorkai's oeuvre. They are seemingly as simple as a cloud appearing on the sky, the gaze of a Buddha statue, and a dying dog below a ginkgo tree, but the sheer immensity with which he contrasts gentle peace, or at least visions thereof, with inescapable horror makes it a thematic precursor to Seiobo there below. But contrast might be the wrong word, because it's the wholeness and at the same time absence of a whole that is the key concern for Krasznahorkai, as I've said before, and will repeat again. I don't want to read quotes from the images I mentioned, since it's best you see them embedded in their context. However, I will come back to Paths from a Mountain when I talk about Seiobo. The Prison of Urga is an early book that I believe hasn't been translated to English, and it reads more like a travelogue. Most parts of it are written from the first person, and there are letters that start with Dear Krasznahorkai, for example. So I don't know how fair it would be to rank the reading experience among his other books, but I will say that since the problem of narration is carried out by having the narrators embody that, if that phrasing makes sense, it's kind of lost with the first-person narration. Maybe it's thematically comparable to Destruction and Sorrow Beneath the Heavens, which is subtitled A Reportage as well. Here are some brief quotes from The Prison of Urga that will show you how, even in this early stage just after Satantango, the same problems are wrestled with in different contexts. To my shame, I do not understand the essential. I will endure. I told myself that I will not find what I am looking for, not because it does not exist, but because I am blind to find it until the end of time. Bow before the barely glimpsed order of the world. Earth and heaven are not separate, only I am separate from the earth, as from heaven and from the gods, separate from the ceremonies with which I could summon them. These ceremonies will, by the way, again play a major role in Seiobo. From then on, all my hours were spent in this duality, namely looking and not seeing what I was looking at, approaching and immediately rejecting, incessantly searching for a meaning behind the visible, but immediately fleeing from the meaning before it could take on any form. I know neither the direction nor the object of my homesickness. I only have to endure this homesickness as it drives me towards something, to something unknown to me. There is no chance for questionability in the world, for there one can only observe the rising and dying waves of equally important revelations. Hell exists. There is no contact between the heavenly and the infernal. There is not the slightest correspondence between heavenly and infernal knowledge. They are unreachable for each other. Now, before I get into this video's final two books, Herscht and Seiobo, a quick word on the shorter and sometimes formally more experimental works. The Manhattan Project is a series of photographs, letters and diary-like entries that accompany Krasznahorkai on his journey to write Spadework for a Palace, and while it's a nice look behind the scenes in that it is pretty much without the filter of narration, it doesn't really add much to the story in my opinion, which is not on the stronger side itself. However, it introduced me to the architect Lebbeus Woods, whose sketches I really admire. Spadework for a Palace is about the librarian Mr. Herman Melville, who is obsessed with the writer of the same name, and there's a nice quote I want to read out. Art is not something that resides in an object. Art is not some aesthetic statement, not some kind of message. There is no message. And in any case, art is merely related to beauty. It is not identical with it. And especially art does not limit itself to enchantment, no. In its own extraordinary way, art even banishes that, so that it is not in a book, a sculpture, a painting, a dance, or a piece of music where we have to look for art, because we should not even have to look for it, since art is instantly apprehended if it is present. So when we speak of art, enchantment is not the issue, but the fact that the presence of art creates, how shall I put it, an exceptional atmosphere within a given space. And this may be brought about by a book, a sculpture, a painting, a dance, a piece of music, even a person. That's the only way I can define it. Art is a cloud that provides shade from the sweltering heat, or a flash of lightning that splits the sky, where in that shade's shelter, or that lightning's flash, the world simply becomes not the same as before. A space is created that's suddenly very cold or very hot. In other words, due to some ineffable agency, every single particle of a given space all at once becomes something other than its surroundings. But enough of that. There are other interesting takes as well, like that this universe is in a state of war and that destruction does not exist because it is going on every single moment anyway, that reality is catastrophe. But again, the key aspect that is in fact only articulated in here will make more sense to mention towards the end of the video. Chasing Homer, which is about someone hunted fleeing from a certain murder, is an example of Krasznahorkai condensing his style by not caring about holding the reader's hand, but straight going for the force he feels. And in fact, Animal Inside, about whose plot I don't want to say too much, is one of my favorites of his, since it feels like frenzy put to paper, so kind of at the other end of the spectrum from the meditative stories. Both are collaborations with artist Max Neumann, and in fact with Chasing Homer you can listen to drum solos by Sylvester Miklos while reading. There are no quotes in Chasing Homer that I haven't already read out in similar form, but I want you to listen to this one from Animal Inside. It isn't true that we can't see, it's just that we think about these things a little differently, namely, that is to say, we have a particular sense for it, which tells us that the colors are there, and with the help of this sense we always can tell with hair's breadth accuracy what is the color of this or that thing, so that we are the most bountiful. Because for us everything has a color, it's just that we don't see it, but we know it. That is to say, we are perfectly aware that they exist. And besides that, perfectly aware of what these colors are like. It doesn't matter that what we perceive directly, you could say, almost directly negates color itself, or rather that it extends merely from black to grey, and even this moreover in the infinite series of shades between the two, because the only thing that matters is that no matter where we look, no matter what we see, we know with deadly certainty that the colors are there, and that up there above it's the same. The World Goes On is a story collection that is in a similar vein as these shorter works here, and I feel it's unjustly not talked about as much as his more famous ones. Maybe I can say that because the German translation includes The Last Wolf, a strong story which was published separately with Hermann the Warden in English. The way it's structured is, as is the case with most of his novels, pretty interesting because the individual parts, and in these parts the stories, almost feel like chapters tied together by a shared concern. The first few stories, for example, are similar to the shorter experimental works in that they are more concerned with conveying pace than plot, which I'm an absolute fan of, and the collection as a whole shows Krasznahorkai's range. I mentioned earlier that the collection contains a story where a character talks about the book, The Melancholy of Resistance, and in fact the book does contain takes on the concept of melancholy, similar to how War and War talked about love as resistance. In an interview, Krasznahorkai said, "The existence of transcendence becomes, with time, a peculiar melancholy that is essentially almost empty and involves the memory, I was happy." Another thing I mentioned is the importance of nothingness for Krasznahorkai, and what better story to illustrate it than The Swan of Istanbul, which is 79 paragraphs on blank pages. Or this very fun one. The diocesan bishop sits sadly among the congregation and he says, "This is the end of the reading of the scriptures, for there has been no understanding." Their musings that again could be read like comments on his books themselves, quote, "The whole exists in its wholeness, the parts in their own particularity, and the whole and the parts cannot be lumped together, they don't follow from another," unquote. There's a tender story about an angel-like woman struggling in a post office. There are many quotes I've noted that I really enjoyed, but I feel that if I go into detail about every book Krasznahorkai has written, that'll simply go beyond the scope of this video. And we still have to get to my two favorites of his. Herscht 07769 has a very special place in my heart, not only because it's set in Germany and one of my favorites by Krasznahorkai, but because it gave me the chance to attend two readings where he talked about his work and where I could ask him a question, but more on that later. It is one single sentence over more than 400 pages, nevertheless with chapter titles or quote-unquote rainbow strands mixed in, and the English translation by Ottilie Mulzet from New Directions is about to be published around the time this video will be out. They've been so kind to send me the advanced text from which I will quote here. One thing about the earlier books such as Satantango and Melancholy is that there, the pace is chopped up by shifts in perspective, as I've said, tone and time, whereas Herscht can be read as one singular acceleration. It's like a particle accelerator picking up speed, and at one point at around half of the book it snaps and goes savage. Right off the bat from the opening words, the prose sucks you in and doesn't let you go until you end up alone in the dark and don't remember how you got there. A brief summary of the plot should be enough to intrigue any reader. I quote from New Directions blurb with my own additions mixed in. The gentle giant Florian Herscht has a problem. Having faithfully attended Herr Köhler's adult education classes in physics, he's convinced that disaster is imminent. The teacher taught him that the universe only exists because of an accident, that naturally matter and antimatter annihilate each other. But once, when 1,000,000,001 particles of matter appeared, there were 1,000,000,000 particles of antimatter. And only because of this surplus, this mistake, does the universe exist. And so he embarks upon a one-sided correspondence with Chancellor Angela Merkel to convince her of the danger of the complete destruction of all physical matter, because the existential fear he has is that another mistake might happen at any given moment, creating a surplus of antimatter and thereby annihilating the universe. Florian works for the boss, the head of a local neo-Nazi gang, who has taken him under his wing and gotten him work as a graffiti cleaner in the small eastern German town of Kana, postal code 07769. There, the citizens complain about how much better things used to be, and all they want is order and for things to stay the same they have always been. But they'd also rather give up reality than their fear. The boss is enraged by a graffiti artist who is defacing the various monuments to Johann Sebastian Bach in Thuringia with wolf emblems. A Bach fanatic and director of an amateur orchestra, the boss is determined to catch the culprit with the help of his gang. Florian has no choice but to join the chase. Havoc ensues when real wolves are sighted in the area. Krasznahorkai's prose is constantly moving, and each event leads to an acceleration, as I've said, which the residents counter with motionlessness. In one of his letters, Florian tells Merkel that there is no such thing as speed on the atomic level, only a, quote, perpetually lightning-quick series of events. This might as well be a comment on the novel itself, which feels like outspread intensity. The clarity with which the whole cast of characters is described is astounding, all the more since Krasznahorkai manages to navigate different perspectives in this one sentence. First and foremost, of course, our hero Florian Herscht. Science doesn't offer him any answers because it only operates in the realms of the mind. And he finds a radically different way of understanding, which is offered by the music of Bach, and which speaks in a way that goes beyond mere logic. Florian is most definitely an angel, but with an interesting twist to the figures I've talked about before, such as Baron Wenckheim and Valushka, which Krasznahorkai mentioned at the reading. A real angel has two faces, or two sides to his face, and it's probably better if I leave it at that, because the effect of the acceleration is just way better experienced by reading it yourself. In a way, Herscht is a German novel as well as a contemporary one. Musicians rather want to play music from Game of Thrones than Bach's hymns. The COVID pandemic is just around the corner. Terrorist attacks are coordinated in deep web forums. And there is a passage that describes the citizens' attitude towards the neo-Nazis with dark humor, though it might be a bit on the nose in this case. Quote, "She roasted pork chops with a special brown sauce on the side. She herself was not so crazy about this gravy. Moreover, if she were to be sincere, she betrayed to one of her loyal readers in the library, Auntie Ingrid. She was bored of brown sauce, but her husband liked it, and he always liked it in a certain way. So there it was with the pork chops, and she and Auntie Ingrid laughed, and Auntie Ingrid confessed that she was the same. Ever since she'd been a child, there was always just brown sauce and boiled potatoes with pork chops. It's a tradition with us, and that's that," said the old lady, holding a few romance novels in her hand, clutching them to herself because she'd already checked them out. And once again they laughed at the whole thing. Yes, brown sauce. That goes best with roasted pork chops. Only she, Frau Ringer pointed at herself, put it frankly, she was a little tired of it. She would really like to make something else to go with pork chops, but her husband... Well, yes, Auntie Ingrid nodded. And she said goodbye. She stepped out of the library. Frau Ringer thought that still she might try to sneak in something different for weekend lunch, just so it wouldn't always be those same old pork chops with brown sauce. It was a good and cheap meal and everything, but still, for once they could try something else. But of course, this is not exclusive to Germany, and as always, Krasznahorkai accesses the universal through this specific lens. Just listen to this passage, for example. He meant this not merely in a political or societal sense, but in the overall sense as well. His view was that they had lost the battle, and not only that, he added, but maybe even the war as well, because they were coming up from the sewers. As always occurred in these historical pauses, they emerged, ruining everything, destroying and debasing whatever they touched, degrading everything that was valuable, fouling what was sacred for others, spreading a disease against which there was no vaccine, because it was not the pandemic that was the danger, but instead this infection, the main symptom of which was that people showed the worst side of themselves, and they were weak and immeasurably idiotic. And what can we do about this? Two of the major forces in this novel that are not always on the surface with all that's hectically going on are opposing poles of emptiness, a calm, zen-like state of peace and quiet, versus restless petrification and fear, losing one's drive to live. Quote, to illustrate that, Ferdinand leaned back in his chair and he thought of nothing. This, for him, was the most agreeable feeling in the world. To sit in his chair behind the window of his porter's booth and to think of nothing. And in that, in Kana, he was not alone, because Herr Feldmann also truly liked to do so, even if he himself wouldn't have called it thinking of nothing. He spoke to his wife about how, on a pleasant afternoon, he would sit down in his favorite leather armchair, lean back, close his eyes, and to him this was paradise itself. Nothing happening. His thoughts, as he put it, came to a stop, moving in no direction. It's like that Zen state of yours, he said, referring to Brigitte's favorite pastime, as she had been doing Zen meditation for years now, and she tried to get her husband into it as well. But he just dug in his heels and just laughed at this whole Zen thing, seeing it as an activity aging hucksters had come up with to relieve middle-aged women of large amounts of cash. Now, compare this humorous passage to the relationship Florian has with Johann Sebastian Bach's music. Quote, he did not have a personal relationship to Bach, because whenever he listened to Bach, he himself became nothing. That which was exactly he himself disappeared. Bach took dominion over him. If Bach was speaking, it didn't matter who was listening, because if Bach spoke, he listened. But more precisely, if Bach spoke, there was no need of any listener. Florian was of the opinion that Bach also spoke even when no one was listening. Bach was continuously saying something, and sometimes people listened to him, but Bach was speaking. He was speaking all the time. At one point Bach had begun to speak, and ever since then he hadn't stopped. Once like Bach, thought Florian, begin to speak at one point and they never stop. And for them, and all the others here in Thuringia and everywhere in the world, the only task was to listen as much as they could. And it was always like this with geniuses, he thought. And this, so to speak, dialectics of nothingness that is directly related to Florian's relationship with Bach and his development in the book is comparable to earlier novels such as the thought-emptying exercises the professor did in Baron Wenckheim, but its realization is not through logic and theory, but instead the angelic, embodied knowledge more comparable to Valushka. Quote, anyone who listens to Bach would sense that realm. Florian got to this part in the letter, but this was only the first thing that he wanted to write, because the second thing was, inasmuch as this was true, and it was true, then the universe was much, not even bigger, not even more capacious, but, and now he would specify what he meant, it comprised a much more abundant wholeness, itself only apprehended by means of another viewpoint, radically differing from the conventions of science, although not unscientific or anti-scientific, not some kind of mystical or transcendent or other foolish gobbledygook, but instead an image of the real obtained via a different view. Only that the construction of this reality, its logic, is not yet before us. Because we cannot know here what exists there in place of a causal system, the experiential world as sensed by ourselves. From the viewpoint of this veritable realm is only an idea, a mere idea, Mrs. Chancellor, of what reality truly is. Hence this dear Earth and everything that we think about it and the universe that surrounds us is perhaps but a mere misunderstanding. A misunderstanding of that veritable realm, for which he could not find at the present moment a more precise designation, only realm. But even this term communicated nothing, because it was difficult to describe something, the vocabulary or grammar of which is unknown to us. But this vocabulary and this grammar is in all of Bach, and it didn't matter if he designated this God or faith, it doesn't matter, Mrs. Chancellor, Florian wrote with growing enthusiasm, as long as we listen. And if we listen to him, to Bach, then we can be certain not only that this realm truly exists, but there is a path leading to it. There's also another kind or variation of this drive, a more animalistic one based on instincts, but I want to stick with Bach for a moment. This passage, like so many I read out in this video, mirror Krasznahorkai's search for accessing what lies beyond words through rhythm. And when he was asked by a reader about the various symbols and allegories at the reading event, such as the wolves for example, he answered, "There are no symbols to be found in my book. It's not an allegory. I don't need secondary sources for poetry either. When you read Hölderlin, Hölderlin is enough." And this sentiment can be found in Herscht itself, when Florian finally begins to get the music of Bach. Quote, he felt that even so the messages were getting through to him. That's what he called them, messages. The sounds and the ensemble of the sounds, although he didn't want to decipher them. Moreover, his immediate impression was that these messages had no meaning. They were beautiful in and of themselves. They were wondrous in and of themselves. They merely were. He did not wish to translate them, and there was no need, because they were not transmitting something, they only were what they were. He could not imagine what the boss had been thinking of when he spoke of deciphering them. Back in War and War, there was a similar passage where the formulation in the German translation was quite nice. It read something like, the manuscript contained nothing but itself. And here, the art's message was itself too. The message was, it was just there. This is a point one might glance over too fast, but it's of major importance to Krasznahorkai's writing. Now, finally, what I consider to be the crown, or at the very least one of them, of Krasznahorkai's oeuvre. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that he usually starts a new novel when he is forced to read back his last one and finds rhythmic errors. About Seiobo there below, he said in an interview, "An error in a sentence kills me. That's why I can't stand reading my books, because it's practically impossible to write a 300-page book without a single mistake. Seiobo is different. I still like it after years." Krasznahorkai's books are, as I've shown, always also comments on themselves. So while reading, you re-evaluate how you read and what it means to be a reader. In this instance, it took me a longer time to finally get what it did to me. He doesn't answer questions like what is beauty or what is reality. He doesn't even ask them explicitly, but his long sentences circle around a truth that is beyond the logical order of words. So it's much more a meditation in which the reader can partake, a natural letting things unfold themselves. But make no mistake, core themes such as blindness by absolute and utter darkness on the one hand, and a light too bright to handle on the other are still very much present. The themes are just looked at from a different standpoint. I looked back through my notes that chronicled my reading experience, and since I read it right after Herscht, I wasn't hooked immediately since it felt like hitting the brakes a bit. It's not as fast and as chaotic. But once it grows on you and it clicks and you slowly start to understand its rhythm and the direction it's taking you to, it won't let you go anymore. It's very much a universal book, and the impact it had on me has been among the most profound. While in his other books, an outside force is invading the texts, here the prose is taking you to that very outside, or at least hinting at it. In his book Solenoid, Romanian writer Mircea Cătărescu's narrator writes that literature only paints doors on the walls, but never serves as a real escape. I'd argue that the narrator is wrong, and Seiobo does manage just that, where a lot of his other works let you feel the outside. As I said, this one evokes something beyond the page, at least it did for me. There was a time when I read one of his stories that are set in Japan, the one on Inoue Kazuyuki sensei's life, when I stopped reading and had an experience that, while calling it spiritual would sound too far-fetched, but my everyday life simply was somehow directly affected or inspired by the reading, and it carried over just like how Krasznahorkai said about War and War would. The long sentences in this case oftentimes feel like they were not only conveying a certain feeling of the eternal recurrence or of time passing or not passing, but the words very carefully circle around what cannot be said, and this is the high mastery of Krasznahorkai. Here again his stories and their content correspond to the form. One might read it as sort of more fleshed out in what A Mountain to the North already hinted at, the worldly terror and unbearable agony coupled with eternal peace that is present but unreachable, and maybe vice versa too. And like the sensei says in the Seiobo story, the real universe is not somewhere beyond, it already exists. And Seiobo is not yearning for peace, but is peace. And if you compare that to Florian Herscht and saying that the apocalypse is not waiting for us, it's the natural state of the world and universe, you start to see the whole range of Krasznahorkai in his quote-unquote holistic vision. And indeed, the stories sorted by the Fibonacci sequence maybe feel not like a novel, but like something whole, and there are stories with great and funny characters such as Private Passion and Just a Dry Strip in the Blue, as well as some with super high intensity such as Something is Burning Outside. And especially the stories set in Japan describe different crafts and arts in detail, and this is where we arrive at another central point. Krasznahorkai said that he had, quote, no idea why my style is what it is and how it has become. And he goes on to compare writing with the Buddhist craftsman from Seiobo, for whom the wood is essential and nothing else matters. Quote, the language is the essence in this sense. In music, you can hit something in the middle of the heart with a sound, but we know that we do nothing about it. And in another place he said, in truth, all geniuses are only interested in matter. A true poet knows the power of words and knows how to deal with them. Whoever has this ability will only have to deal with technical issues. An artist has only one task, to continue a ritual, and rituals are pure technique. And now that we have arrived at this notion of knowing through not knowing, which might sound familiar if you've heard of Shoshin, the beginner's mind in Zen Buddhism, I want to quote from A Mountain to the North again. Behind the abbot's cushion there was, built into the wall, a tokonoma with a thin hanging roll. Upon it there was written in 31 characters an enigmatic and irregular waka poem from the pen of the famous repudiated son of Kobodaishi. The Buddha does not leave, the Buddha does not come. Search in vain, the Buddha is not here. Gaze into the depths, look for nothing, there are no questions. Don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming that Krasznahorkai is a Buddhist philosopher or something. The cultures and practices in Seiobo are manifold, and in his whole work there are geniuses from all kind of epochs and backgrounds. It's just that with my personal background as a reader, this gave me some, albeit probably worthless tools to articulate what can be articulated in the writing that doesn't articulate what can't be articulated but nevertheless evokes it. In Herscht, Florian Herscht learns or believes that existence itself was not supposed to be, was a mistake, reality a misconception, and the book's epigraph is, hope is a mistake. But as much as hope is a mistake and reality is a misconception, it still just is. The message is itself, and so hope is a mistake, but a mistake is hope too. And in a recent interview, Krasznahorkai explained that saying there is only hope is the same as saying there is no hope. And looking back at all the books I've mentioned here, this is what Krasznahorkai stands for most prominently, for hope. Albeit hope may be a mistake, or as Kafka said, there is hope but not for us, which is in a way a very beautiful message too. And so when I got my copy of Herscht signed, I told Krasznahorkai his work reminded me of the Heart Sutra, because the way he explained his dictum hope is a mistake is hope, reminded me of the part of the sutra form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and that I felt like while his writing is concerned with what seems to be opposites or dualities, such as parts and the whole, light and darkness, two faces of an angel, presence and absence, heavenly and worldly, vision and reality, fiction and reality, all the motives we've looked at in this video, you name them. What his writing does is kind of take them to the level where they are one. They aren't dualities anymore, just sides of a mask. And I got my answer while reading a spadework for a palace just a few months ago, where it says, in all caps, there is no dualism in existence. So the divide is absolute, the parts and the whole can't be harmonized, and yet, to quote Krasznahorkai from an interview, it is always about the problem of the whole and the details, about how details become a whole. Buddha never allowed anyone to speak of totality, because that is an abstract, because totality has no correspondence in reality. We have to be very careful with the word completeness. For example, we believe that the world, the universe is infinite. This is a failure. These last few minutes might have made it obvious that there's no use in trying to articulate what my reaction to Krasznahorkai's fiction has been like, but just take it as my testament that literature can evoke and can get at, or at least hint at, something I personally simply would have no access to otherwise, as cryptic as that might sound. And to end this, I quote one of the sentences most dear to me from Herscht, which reads, "Do you know that there is nothing else that is perfect, only the world?" Michael Silverblatt called Seiobo there below a restoration of the human through the restoration of art. And in conversation with him, Krasznahorkai said, "I believe in nothing, but I believe in the human who believes." And this is what I want to end this video with, here, now, at the full stop, after the last word.